So we got 3 persons that are going to recap their videos, and I'm going to go back to screen share and then give you the listing. So we have Dr. Joe Eickley, our extension weed specialist, who talked about Palmer amaranth in the video, and Dr. Jeff Stockler, who's our new Griggs County Extension agent. He had discussed water hemp, and then Alicia Harstead, our Stutsman County Extension agent. She has a master's in weed science, and she had a nice program outlining horseweed or mare's tail management. So I'm going to jump back out, and we'll get to hear from these 3 speakers directly, hear their introduction of themselves, and a very quick summary about what they talked about in the video. Joe, would you please begin with the introduction?
Yeah, good morning. Joe Eickley, Extension Weed Specialist based out of campus, or today South Campus, or my home, but based out of Fargo. In my video, I kind of just recapped the Palmer amaranth situation in 2020. And really, it was a relatively quiet summer until Labor Day. And then my fall was busy after that. But the main takeaway was that we had several introductions through contaminated feed. And in this case, for this year, it seems like it was mainly sunflower screenings. But, any other feed sources could be contaminated as well. There's some issues with cotton down in Minnesota and Wisconsin this year. And so I really just kind of gave a summary of that, the story, how it evolved. At the time I made the video, we had not conducted resistance screening yet. Very early indicators, we have conducted 2 rounds, is that we do have glyphosate and group 2 resistance coming in, and good possibility of atrazine resistance as well, coming in with the seed that was pulled directly out of the contaminated feed. So trying to figure out what resistance there is coming in through that source. And so that's basically an addition to what I did not have in the video there.
Thank you, Joe. Jeff, could we get your introduction, please?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Stockler. I am the new Griggs County Extension agent. I was most recently in Ohio as an agent there and have some experience with water hemp. I have a weed science degree, and so I've studied water hemp quite a bit. And I just wanted to reiterate some things about properly identifying water hemp early in the season. That's very important. Water hemp was present in 13% of soybean fields at the time of harvest in Griggs County in 2020. If you don't change your management strategies, then water hemp will only get worse, as seen or presented in the video that has happened in West Central Ohio. Joe just mentioned about resistance. Resistance is a big issue for water hemp as well, and we need to be concerned about that. So use herbicides wisely, and including using full rates of herbicides. And one of the other last take-home messages is that a single herbicide application almost never controls water hemp for the season. That's what I wanted to present here at the beginning, Greg.
Thank you, Jeff. And Alicia, can we hear your introduction, please?
Yeah, I'm Alicia Harstead. I'm the Stutsman County Extension agent based out of Jamestown. And I present about horseweed or mare's tail. So depending on, it's a tomato kind of a thing. So depending on where you're at in the state, some people call it horseweed, some people call it mare's tail. But it is a fall biennial weed. So fall control is the best time to control it, whether you're spraying it. Tillage is also very effective. So in the last fall of 2019, 2018, those last 2 falls are pretty wet, and a lot of people struggled getting any fall work done, whether that was tillage or spraying, which is why we're starting to see a little bit more horseweed in the state. But now, hopefully, with the nice fall we had this fall, hopefully it won't be quite as much of an issue. But so whether you're spraying in the fall or tillage, those are the best ways to control horseweed. One thing you want to be thinking about is just don't apply glyphosate by itself, because we do have quite a few glyphosate resistant populations in North Dakota, and there is even some glyphosate and ALS together resistant populations of horse feed, and ALS or group 2 resistance. But when you're picking out your herbicide, also be thinking about your crop rotation, because you want to make sure you're following those crop rotation restrictions with whatever herbicide you choose. So that's kind of a summary of my presentation.
Thanks, Alicia. Well, it's now time for you as audience to ask some questions of our weeds people. So if you enter your questions in the chat box.
Got a question for Joe. Can you educate me? This is from Sarah. Can you help educate me about what the North Dakota Department of Ag is doing to help manage resistant weeds in feed products?
That's a good one, Sarah. Nice, easy one to start off the questions here. Currently, I believe they are reevaluating what they can do. Especially since these were screenings, that's kind of a, I don't know what if you want to call it, a legal loophole. It's not a very well regulated industry. I'll put it that way. For the particular instance this year, there was an agreement made to incinerate future screenings from the source. That was an issue that we found in a couple places this year. So that has been resolved moving forward. As far as the screenings themselves, that will probably take some further investigation as to what legal pathways the Department of Ag has as a regulatory agency for those screenings.
From Anissa Hoffman, Joe, this goes to you as well. What extent has Palmer been found in the state?
So I believe we are up to 13 counties. Sargent County was a late addition this year as a result of an investigation from the Department of Ag. So that's 13 counties that we know where we have found it. Of course, there's always a possibility of a couple counties out there that we just have not, found Palmer in yet. Most of those findings, it has been within 1 or 2 operations. So, it's not like it's all over the county when you see a county lit up on the maps that we share. 2 counties have had repeats or additional findings. But in the large part, what I'll basically say is that most findings from 2018 and 2019, we have not found Palmer at again in 2020. So this early detection rapid response approach has really helped us manage the populations that we found. At least 1 or 2 of the new findings in 2020 is going to take a few years to clean those sites up just because of the number of Palmer plants there. And there could be more sites like that out there that we just don't know about. So, for what we know, I'd say 13 counties. Infestation levels, if I wanted to give an acreage amount, I'd say we're still under 500 in the state that we're aware of, and that's 500 where Palmer is present, not like it's completely overrun. So that would kind of be my guess there.
Thank you, Joe. I have a question for Jeff. We know that we have Waterhemp resistance in the state. Do you want to mention the 2 herbicide groups where we have resistance, and then the potential for expansion based on what has been found in the U.S.?
Yeah, we know for sure there's resistance to glyphosate in the group 2, the ALS inhibiting herbicides in the state. It's a matter of where those populations get introduced from, as was mentioned from Joe with the Palmer, as to what else might be included with that. And one of the things that I had seen in some work back in Ohio there, that the weed specialist had tested some plants or seed populations for me, was that there's many different herbicides that may have less activity than what you would expect. Now, whether they're truly resistant or not, there's that information is too early to know that for sure. But the point is that there is a type of resistance that we call metabolic resistance. And if you have that, you tend to have what I call low level resistance. And so if you catch it early, you're getting some control, but not complete control. And if you continue to do the same practices, then you're going to select for those that have that higher level of resistance. And you'll change that population and it will truly be resistant. The other issue with metabolic resistance is that you can have resistance to a herbicide that you've never used before because of the methods or metabolic processes in the plant that might be breaking down multiple types of herbicides. So those are some of the biggest concerns about resistance in water hemp.
We have another question for Joe from Austin Lang. How are the areas with Palmer contained?
Yeah, good question, Austin. So, for many of them, the majority of the findings have been few enough plants that we were able to actually go through and hand weed, rogue, and remove plants that were found. So that's the majority of the findings have been that low of enough level, and then subsequent monitoring in subsequent years to make sure there's no Palmer present. One or two of the other, the more heavily infested sites, we've scouted around those locations, and it has been contained to individual operations at this point. So while we do know Palmer can spread a number of different ways, it's most likely to spread through contaminated equipment once it's been introduced. And we did not see any signs of spread outside of fields where that equipment had been used. So at this point, it's going to be subsequent monitoring, and then of course keeping an eye out for other areas, just independent of the couple of operations that we're working with to help control Palmer this year and in future years.
Joe, you've got another question from Sarah again. Considering water hemp and Palmer, where do you think these populations have the best chance of survival? What crops are the most at risk? It seems like water hemp is in the eastern side of the state. Is this only an eastern North Dakota issue?
Yep. Yeah. Great question, Sarah. So if I look at water hemp versus Palmer in general, Palmer is going to like more dry areas. Water hemp is going to like more wet locations. I just like to say that there's a reason the word water is in water hemp. Now, that doesn't mean that they cannot adapt and thrive in other areas as well. We're certainly finding water hemp in the central part of the state and moving west where it's a little more arid. The areas that we found Palmer and where it tended to be thriving, as in getting these large plants that we see pictures of from other states, those have been more marginal soils, not like our Fargo clays. If I'd sit here and guess, I'd say that water hemp is so firmly entrenched in the Red River Valley that I don't see Palmer being able to establish and push water hemp out. Now, I could be wrong, but just knowing what I know about how those two survive in different soil types and our water holding capacity in the Red River Valley soils, I think water hemp will continue to be the dominant problem. With Palmer, there's more marginal soils and ones that can be prone to flash droughts, or where Palmer will tend to be happy. Both pigweeds do love nitrogen. So if you use manure or a high nitrogen situation, so anything that has corn or high nitrogen using crop in the rotation, they're going to really like those soil types. And then operations that don't have either yet, I think that whether it's water hemp or Palmer, once one shows up, they'll be able to adapt quite readily and survive. As far as crops, our summer annual crops, corn, soybean, the ones we tend to plant a little later, I'd say, compared to something like peas or small grains, are going to be more at risk because water hemp and Palmer won't germinate until May into June. It's kind of their peak germination window. So if we get a crop canopy developed before we hit that window, then it's going to be less of a risk in other crops. So really it's going to be those crops and knowing that we have resistance to glyphosate, group 2 herbicides, crops that rely, or operations, I'll say, that rely on those 2 types of chemistries will also be higher risk.
Alicia, the next question is for you. If we didn't have any mare's tail emerge this fall, can we expect a high pressure in the spring?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a complete no, because if you've had a bunch of mare's tail or horseweed in the past, it can also emerge in the spring. Unfortunately, it's just usually the plants that emerge in the fall and then grow through the spring. They always have a head start with their growth, so they're a little bit more competitive with the crop than, say, the spring emerging ones. So that's not a flat out no, but I would just say if it's a field that you've struggled with horseweed and mare's tail in the past, you probably might be seeing some in the spring. If it's one that you really haven't had too much of a struggle, it probably isn't going to be as that big of an issue in the spring, but probably just one to watch.
Joe, back to you. Is it true that Palmer, this is from Caitlin Keller, is it true that Palmer is being brought in millet seed? I create a lot of cover crop mixes, and should I watch out for certain seed? How can I be sure?
Yeah, Caitlin, great question. That was basically our findings in 2019, where we were finding Palmer in millet fields. We never did get our hands on a bag to truly test if it was coming in that bag. But I can say the one operation was permanent grass pasture for about 20 years. And the first year that was broken up and planted, it was planted to millet, and we were finding Palmer directly in the rows. So that's about as damning as the evidence as we can get that it did come in on seed. And at varying levels as well. So the one operation where we walked, we were finding maybe 1 plant per acre at a seeding rate of 20 pounds of millet per acre. So we could have some slipping in at very low rates. Other operations had more, but so if we combine what we found last year in North Dakota, what has been found in Delaware, in Indiana, another state that slipped in my mind in past years, we have found it coming in on millet or being spread through millet seed. So that is, as far as the cover crops that we would use, that's probably one of the highest risk ones in my mind for being contaminated with Palmer. And it's probably just where that millet seed is being produced is, states south of us in the plains that deal with Palmer more frequently than we do.
We have about 5 minutes left for questions. If anybody has any more, now's the time to ask.
Alicia, I have a question for you. We've had a wonderful fall compared to last year, and do you think there's any time when it's too late to control horseweed in the fall, given that there's some viable green yet on the plant where it'll absorb the herbicide application? In other words, could the plants possibly be too large where we would have ineffective herbicide application? Or are there other factors that may make the application not as effective based on growth or environmental conditions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I misspoke too. I think I said when I first did my introduction that I said it's a biennial, it's a winter annual. So I just want to clarify that. But when you're talking about spring and the fall, if the plant is still growing, it should be able to still absorb the herbicide, and you should be able to still get some control. So it is starting to get late, but like you said, we've been having very mild weather, but it's probably starting to get late. And then plant size is always an issue with any herbicide and any weed. Once horseweed starts to bolt, that's when you're really not going to get much for herbicide control. So as long as it hasn't started to bolt yet, you probably should be okay. But again, the smaller weeds, general rule for any herbicide, any weed, the smaller your weeds are, the better herbicide control you're going to get.
So we have 2 more questions, and that's likely we may have time for one more after this, but Joe, this is going to go back to you, Palmer related. The first is from Sarah. Is Palmer going to be an issue in pulse crops? And then the second question is from Kendall Nichols. Will grinding the screening destroy the Palmer seed enough to prevent germination?
All right, two great questions. So pulse crops, Sarah, yes, if it gets established there, we have kind of one shot with pre-emergence herbicides, and then based on what we have resistance to, won't really have any good options to clean up palmer. So if we have a crop that is not canopied and we don't have any herbicide options, and we know that palmer can have a long germination window, then yes, it can certainly be a problem in pulse crops. And then Kendall, as far as grinding the seed, you have to use something very aggressive like a hammer mill, and it can actually reduce germination. So there's some research from my colleagues down in Missouri and Arkansas where they're attaching these hammer mills on the back of combines, and we call it harvest weed seed control. And even though palmer seed is very small, when it goes through that hammer mill, it does crack and is abrasive enough on the seed coat that it does actually reduce germination quite a bit. So it's going to take something like a hammer mill that very finely grinds material, and the material will have to be dry when you feed it through, of course. But the research coming out of the South has shown that yes, it does actually reduce viability of amaranth seed.
We have about 1 minute left, I think. If anybody else has any last minute questions, feel free to fire away. If not, I'm going to turn this back over to Greg.
Sam's comment, you mentioned that if any speakers have any last minute comments, we'll take them as long as they're very brief.
I think I would just like to thank the commodity groups for their support, and a good example of how supportive they are is with the frog eye leaf spot situation we had. I went to the Soybean Council, and within 24 hours they had helped me fund a survey and get isolates down to the University of Kentucky to figure out that we had strobilurin resistance. And then 2 days later we froze. And if they hadn't moved so quick, we would not know about the strobilurin resistant frog eye. And so it's just a nod of my hat to the Soybean Council and the commodity groups in general.
Yes, I'd like to also thank the North Dakota Soybean Council for funding the soybean gall midge survey. And also I really appreciate everyone's eyes out there. This is a very destructive pest down in Nebraska especially, and yield is zero on the field edges where it's been found. So we don't want it here in North Dakota. So please watch for it. The earlier we know it's here, the better we'll be able to take some action against it.
Okay. This is the listing of our speakers, and I do have their email addresses if you'd like to contact them in the future to ask additional questions. Also remember that our extension agents are readily available to answer questions that relate to our subjects, either in this session or others that we covered today. Okay, for those of you who are CCAs, here is the code for getting the registration in the crop management CEU. And so I'll leave that displayed for just a bit. And if you are not able to use that QR app to get registered for the CEU, another option would be to simply just email me with your CCA number, and then we'll just physically sign you up on our hard copy CEU sign-up sheet.